Hi, Julie Usher back. You guys asked for this video, so here it is. I call this my rose lattice cookie video, and the reason you asked for it is because it first appeared as one of the sides in my 3-tier box wedding cake that I did a few months ago, and a lot of people said, hey, that's cool, how'd you do it? So I thought I'd show you how I did it, but I'm going to apply it today to a round cookie just so you can see that it needn't necessarily be applied to the rectangle. It can be applied to a round or any other shape. It's extremely versatile pattern. And in fact, I think this is a good example of how I like to decorate. I very often just rely on very common shapes, rounds and squares, and create patterns within those simple shapes to create a lovely cookie without going to town with different cutter shapes. So I have a small arsenal of cutters that I use over and over again. The first step in this cookie, here's the finished round version, by the way. The first step is to rubber stamp the flower on it. Then we'll mask and do some stenciling and then some coloring of it. So I'm just going to start by rubber stamping. And again, I stamped in brown with my brown liquid gel coloring applied to a stamp pad that has been dedicated to that purpose. There was never anything but edible food coloring on it. And I've blotted off the excess ink because I don't want to have an excess on the stamp anywhere, or it will be a blotchy stamp. I'm just making sure that the whole stamp is completely inked. Good to use a food safe stamp. This is a wood-mounted one, which means it's a little tippier because it's higher off the cookie than some of those that I have on acetate mounts. I think that's pretty well stamped. I'm going to just put it off to the side because I want to leave some room for the lattice to surround the rose. And just press harder than you might think across the entire surface to make sure it makes contact, particularly with the low points in the cookie. And this is sort of rubber stamping 101, which I cover in a video on my DVD series. Pull up the stamp and it looks pretty good. You'll never get a stamp around the edge of the cookie where it bows off to the edge. That's because the icing is just lower there. If you want to paint in those stems, you can, but I'm going to put a border up there, so I think that'll be hidden. So the next step is actually to mask it off and to lay in the brown lattice work, which I do with a royal icing stencil. You could airbrush the stencil on, but I like the royal icing stencils. I feel I have a little more control with it actually relative to airbrushing through a stencil. Plus it gives it a little more relief and a little bit of texture, which I quite like. Now, I'm going to sit for this part of the process, so I'm a little closer to the cookie. I like to stand when I rubber stamp sometimes because I can get a little more leverage on the stamp and I can see over it and make sure that the stamp is centered on the cookie. But for stenciling, I need to be a little bit closer to the cookie for more control. The other thing you want to do is make sure that rubber stamp ink has dried, because we're going to mask over it with a little bit of plastic wrap, and we don't want it wet because the plastic wrap may smear the imprint. I just stamped that one. I'm just going to touch it. It is still a little wet. I think I'm going to work with the one that I stamped a little bit earlier. It might be slightly drier. I did stamp this one relatively recently too. And by masking off, I'm just going to lay a little bit of this. This is Glad Press and Seal. It's nice and sticky for this purpose. Just going to lay it right on top of that so I don't stencil over the rose, but we're going to stencil all the exposed area. And I think I want to let this out a little bit further. It's important for this plastic to lie flat, so the stencil lies flat on top of it. Okay, and this is my lattice stencil. This stencil I got from Designer Stencils, as I get most of them. Okay, and now I've got my stenciling icing of stenciling consistency, which is very close to outlining consistency. It's pretty thick. I've got all those consistency adjustments on my site, and I like to keep it covered till the time I'm going to use it. Again, the thicker the icing, the better. You'll see it just clings to the back of the offset spatula. And I'm not going to start with a lot. My first step actually is to just get even coverage on the stencil. And I'm going to be pressing down and moving my hands around as I add icing. I just want to keep that stencil as flat as possible. So I'm just going to strive to get even coverage with the icing, a teeny bit down everywhere. Then we'll come back and do 1 or 2 big swipes to kind of level out the icing. Okay, so now I'm ready to do the final leveling, and for that I want to clean off my spatula and do 1 or 2 swipes to smooth out that roughness you see on top. Keeping my hand on the stencil, so it doesn't move, because if it moves, you'll end up with a blurry stencil, smudge stencil. So that side looks pretty good. I just want to clean this one more time to get this side. And for this, I want to see where I'm moving with the spatula. I'm going to anchor the stencil with a trussing needle on this edge. Then lifting it off, I like to roll my stencil to the side. Looks really pretty beautiful. There's some areas of extra icing to the edge, which I'm going to knock off because we're going to come in with a border later, and that can kind of interfere with the border sometimes. And then you want to, it looks like I stenciled over my rose, but I did not. It looks pretty good. There's a little smudge of the rose here. You can see that's because my stamp may not have been completely dry, and I don't like that little extra bit of icing there, so we're going to clean that off. The next thing I want to do is add color to the rose area, and I'm going to do this primarily by dusting, which is applying dry petal dust with a dry brush to a dry cookie. But I'll do some painted accents that will give more of an opaque look. The dusting gives a very kind of translucent, kind of antique-y vintage look. And for dusting, I like to use a soft brush, soft, clean brush, rather than a hard one, because if you work the dust in with a hard brush, sometimes you really work it into the cookie, and it doesn't look so great. So I'm going to lightly dust, just kind of generously going out of the boundaries a little bit on these roses. And the color I'm using here, it's a CK Products Poppy Red, but when I take off the extra, it tends to look a little more pink than red once I knock off the extra. So I'm going to dust here. See, lightly dusted, it looks kind of pink down here. And knock a little bit of this down with my hand. I'm getting some of this stuff off the side with this bigger brush. Okay, so that's nicely dusted. I'm going to do the same with the green, moss green, putting a little on my work surface, and we'll dust from there. And I'm going to dust in all the area around here just so I kind of, there's more union between the stenciled area and the roses. Just shade in the background by dusting it. And to give the leaves more contrast to the background, the green background dusting will actually paint those in with the dust extended with extract, and it'll look more opaque. Usually I'll leave a little bit more drying time between stenciling and dusting, because if I do have to brush off, it's easy enough to brush it off a dry stencil, but it will stick to that stenciled area if the icing is slightly wet, and I have a little bit of that happening here. So normally I'd let that dry till it was just dry to the touch. Now I'm going to extend that same moss green with a little bit of extract to create a paint. And now taking a smaller brush, I'm going to paint in the leaves and stems. So I'm just going to go in and give these leaves a paint job here, because that sets them off from the dusted green background a little bit better. And the more extract I have relative to dust, the sheerer the paint. You can see here it's pretty translucent, where that first leaf I did is pretty opaque. That's because I just had a higher dust ratio in it. So I'm going to try to mix a little more dust into this next batch of paint that I do. Actually, I'll pick some up from the counter there. Another reason to wait for the stamp to be completely dry is so that there's less bleeding of the stamp color into whatever it is you're painting. I'm picking up some brown in the stems. I don't mind it, because this is basically a brown and green cookie, but I'm picking up more than I usually would if I'd waited a little bit longer to fill in these areas. Okay, I'm just going to finish painting all these leaves, and then I'm going to give some pink, darker pink highlights perhaps to the roses, and then we'll finish this all out with an assortment of beadwork. Okay, now I'm going to give some brighter pink highlights to the roses, and then we'll move on to dot work. And again, if you want more, the more opaque highlights you want, it's better to work with a paint. You can also work with straight food coloring extended with a little extract. That gives a pretty opaque look as well. But since I've got the petal dust out, That's what I'm working with today. And I've got a slightly different shade of pink. It's not so red. It's called Cosmos. Again, CK products. I'm going to paint some of the edges of the flowers with it. Just give it a slightly darker accent. Just gives a little more texture to the paint effect. Okay, so that's a nicely colored stamp. Now we're going to come in and just clean it all up with a little dot work. We're going to start first with our smallest dots and then progress to the larger ones. So you'll see I've got this one, I outlined sort of the boundary between the stenciling and the rose with small brown dots. For dot work, I've got icing of beadwork consistency, which for my cup of icing glue is about 2 to 3 teaspoons of water. Always check my bags here. Okay, so I'm just going to do tiny dots all through here to kind of mark off the boundary. Same color brown that I stenciled with, by the way. And I start with the smaller dots because then I can just use the same bag. Just open up the tip a little bit further to do the big dots. Working in reverse is harder to do. I had to have to swap out bags, and swapping out bags takes time. And so we're always trying to save time where we can. These cookies are generally labors of love, but when I can save steps, I will. Coming around to the last few dots. Okay, I'm going to set that aside. I'm actually going to skip to I'm going to put down the green big, I'm going to do small green dots first. I've got some small green dots to put on. Then we're going to do big green dots. Then we're going to come back to the brown. And I'll tell you why in a sec. I have green dots accenting here. Again, I'm kind of going to town here. You could leave it plainer than I've got it. But I just want to show you how I made that exact cookie. So I'm skipping every other cross section. Skip one. You could do this in any number of ways. Okay, so now I'm ready to move on to big green dots. I want to lay those first. I've got a double beaded border on this cookie, and I find it's easier to lay the ones on the bottom first and then to gauge where the ones on top should go relative to the ones on bottom. So that's why the green's going down first. If you try to do it the other way around, then you're trying to get the green underneath the brown, and it gets a little bit awkward. I haven't opened up the tip of my cone at all. I'm just pushing a lot longer and with more force to get bigger dots. If I wanted to, I could open up the tip, but the icing's so loose, I'm not having to push very hard to get that out anyway. Okay, I'm coming around to the last green dot. Now I'd let those green dots dry until a skin had formed, which is not more than a couple of minutes before I put the big brown dots on top. The good news is I have one more accent that I want to put on these cookies, and those are the little pink dots, which you can see I have in the center of each little cross section of the lattice. So I'm going to do those next. And again, that's icing of beadwork consistency. Whenever I'm doing dots, that's what I'm working with. Normally I'd be doing more than one cookie at a time too, so I'd do all of the same step on one cookie, on all of the cookies at once, then come back and change bags. And by that time, you know, the colors that I just had put down would be dry. So for instance, the green, whereas right now I've done one cookie, ideally I'd let that wait even longer before I put brown dots next to it, because there's some chance of that brown bleeding into the green. But if I were doing a bigger run of cookies, even 3 or 4, by the time I'd finished the third set of green dots, the first might be dry and I could come back and add the brown. So it's nice to be working bigger runs. You're swapping bags out a lot less too. Okay, but we're going to go ahead and add these dots, and I'm just going to show you how I do a double beaded border. I did open up the tip on that a little bit because it was hard getting, I just having difficulty getting that brown icing out easily. And now I'm just, again, I'm using the green dots as the guide as to where to place the brown dots. I'm just going right in between them, but trying not to touch the green dots, just on the edge of the white cookie. It's a little uneven here where I had to go over a piece of stencil that I hadn't knocked down. That's the reason why you want to knock down the stencils. Here it's going to be a lot more uniform because I don't have any stencil interfering with what I'm trying to do. Okay, last dot. And there it is, finished rose lattice cookie. Put it on a rectangle and it works on my 3D wedding cake boxes, which you'll see in another video. Or as it is, it's a perfect gift, a collection of them for a mom who loves flowers, for instance, for Mother's Day, or wedding, or what have you. So, till next time, live sweetly.